I wasn't there then. Anne Gaylor and her daughter Annie Laurie Gaylor and another man who died recently after. The three of them started this group. Anne had started originally on women's issues.
Mm-hmm.
She wrote the first editorial in the state of Wisconsin calling for abortion rights. She was controversial, but she noticed when she was lobbying for women's rights and protesting that it was the church on the other side. And she thought, that doesn't seem right, that the church has all this power, the church that is retarding women's rights. And she referred back to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who had the same problem in her day with women's right to vote. It was the church and the Bible. And one day there was some issue at the city-county building.
Mm-hmm.
And now this is secondhand, so she would have to tell you the story herself, but this is what I remember. They went to testify on some women's issue, and the city-county meeting started with a prayer. And Anne got up and said, "Why do you have a prayer at a secular meeting? This is not a church. This is not a religious thing. We are protesting this prayer." And afterwards, a reporter came up and said, "Well, who are you? What's the name of your group? Who are you people?" And she said, "We are people who want freedom from religion." And so he put in the newspaper, "There's a freedom from religion group in Madison." And so she started getting phone calls and letters, people saying, "How can I join the freedom from religion found group?" And so they started on their dining room table, the three of them, and it grew and it grew. They got an office a few years later. When I came in 1985, it was an office down by the state capitol. We since moved into a building. And the purpose of the Freedom from Religion Foundation has always been twofold: to keep state and church separate,
Mm-hmm.
and to educate the public about the views of those of us who are non-theists, which are atheists, agnostics. We don't care what we call ourselves. Most of our members are atheists, but we're not technically an atheistic group, although I think maybe 80–90% use the word atheist. And then agnostics and igtheists, and our joke is we don't care what you call yourself. We all disbelieve in the same God.
Mm-hmm.
So, so those two purposes work hand in hand, keeping state and church separate through legal activities.
Which you're in the middle of quite a few lawsuits right now, I understand.
Yeah, some lawsuits. Filing lawsuits is a big deal, especially when you win. It's the kind of news that the media can hardly ignore, because it's not just a bunch of atheists saying, "Hey, here's our opinion, report our opinion." It's actually doing something. It's actually trying to make a difference in the country. And actually, we are joined often by religious people who support us, because there's a lot of Christians and Jews and other believers on this continent who support state-church separation. So it looks good. It's not like a bunch of mad atheists who are just trying to change the government. The principle of state-church separation is good for everybody. It's good for religion too. And then, of course, that dovetails into our educational side, because people say, "Well, you're complaining about the Ten Commandments at City Hall. What's wrong with the Ten Commandments? Why would anyone object to the Ten Commandments?" So we get to explain generally the viewpoint of those of us who don't believe. What's wrong with the Bible? What's wrong with belief in God? What's wrong with religious morality? And a dozen other issues that we get to publish books. We have a newspaper. We have a weekly radio show representing. So both of those two things dovetail nicely. They're different sides of the same coin. And keeping state and church separate is something you can actually do, besides just sitting around and talking. And like a lot of atheists, they get together, it's wonderful, but what do? You just hold hands and say, "There's no God, there's no God, there's no God." But what do you do in the world? How can you make a difference? So,
well, the atheists that are out there right now can contribute to your foundation to actually do something.
To make a difference, yeah. So I think that's why the group has grown so fast over the years. Right now we're the largest atheist agnostic group in the country. Beyond just promoting a point of view, positive or negative atheism, we can actually make a difference in the real world. We can actually change the country for the better, to try to fight those who lean towards a theocracy.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. Why isn't the religious right that wants a theocracy, basically, in the United States, why is that bad?
A theocracy creates an in-group and an out-group. Theocracies create a social dynamic, or a cause of social conflict, which historically has been very bad for our species. The holy wars, the shunnings, the killing of witches, the banishing of people who didn't think the right way because they weren't pure or holy. And the colonists to this continent, I mean the later colonists, the ones from Europe, not the ones from Siberia, like my ancestors, but the newcomer colonists came over here purportedly to escape religious persecution. The old joke, of course, is that the Puritans loved religious freedom so much that they kept it all to themselves. They didn't want to share religious freedom. They set up their little colonies which were theocracies. You had to belong and agree, with some exceptions. Roger Williams was a good exception to that, but and so you couldn't vote, or you couldn't be a citizen if you weren't part of if you didn't subscribe to the Trinity, let's say, or whatever. So it made people insiders and outsiders. Theocracies create, there's always going to be social conflict for a lot of other reasons. It could be water rights or who are territory, but religion creates this artificial cause of social conflict that, because it's artificial, tends to be even magnified beyond in order to justify it, your religious differences. So theocracies historically have been very bad for human freedom and human equality and rights for women and rights for all people.
And we can see that today in Iran and Afghanistan, correct?
Yeah, we can see that in countries where, in Islamic countries,
Somalia, for instance,
or Islamist countries, yeah, where they're trying to impose a religious law on the people. And we see it here when there are religious right evangelical Christians who want to impose their versions of morality, sex education in the schools, teaching evolution in the science classroom, and equal rights for gays, and so on. So we see that usually a theocracy, or even if it's not a theocracy, but a religion-influenced government, which our First Amendment also guards against, not just the pure establishment of religion, but anything respecting an establishment of religion.
And what does respecting actually mean? A lot of people interpret that slightly differently.
Well, the founders, when they commented on this, were very clear to say that it had to do with anything leaning towards or dealing with an establishment of religion, not just establishing a national church, but anything that would lean towards it. And proclamations for prayer were one of those things that they talked about. That's why Thomas Jefferson backed off and said, it's beyond my authority as a secular president to direct somebody's private religious worship. So the courts have consistently interpreted the First Amendment Establishment Clause to disallow anything that promotes or hinders, because hindering religion is also respecting an establishment of some religion other than your own. So, so really most of our real activity in the foundation is dealing with trying to preserve that wonderful American principle. We're not trying to create something new. We're basically interested in keeping the views of the founders. Many of the founders were religious, but they didn't want to impose their religion on the rest of us. They thought true religion, those who were religious, should be privately motivated, should be privately persuaded, and not by the force and the endorsement of the government.
Well, what about people who say that it's okay for religion to have an effect on the government, but the government should not interfere with any religion? It only goes one way. Glenn Beck's view, for instance.
Private citizens are free to use their religious views